Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Ian Pryor, the Senior Inventory and Planning Manager at Seven Islands Land Company. I met Ian when I moderated a forest panel at the 2024 Maine Science Festival, and I was struck by both his passion for forestry and what his work in forestry is. As you'll hear, he is not out in the woods every day, but instead integrally involved in the management of the forest as a resource of trees, wildlife, and ecosystems using modeling. Honestly, I find his work deeply fascinating and loved having him give me a deep dive into what he does. Our conversation was recorded in October 2024. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Today's episode of the Maine Science Podcast is brought to you by Bangor Savings Bank, committed to supporting scientific exploration and discovery in Maine. So, Ian, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I had the great good fortune of meeting you at the Science Festival this year before the weather shut us all down. And I was really inspired by your talk about what you do with forestry and how it is by no means at all what most people, I think of when they think of a modern day forester, for lack of a better way to phrase it. So that was what inspired me to talk to you for our podcast. I do know that you are originally from Canada and made your way to Maine. So I was hoping you could give us quick bits of information before we dive into your work, which is why forestry? Like, how'd you get that bug? And how do we get lucky enough to get you in Maine?
Sure. How forestry? I started out just doing a general science, and as a young fellow, I was a little bit confused, I guess, to say the least, and really just stumbled across forestry. I was kind of figuring out what I was going to do with the rest of my life and pursuing a few options, and then forestry came up, and once I got digging into what was offered at the University of New Brunswick, it definitely appealed to me. I think initially, naively, I thought, like many sort of the traditional sort of lumberjack type forester spending all his days in the woods. But the path that forestry has taken me has been anything but that. It's been very much computer-based, technology-based. I consider myself a fair weather forester. I get to go in the woods when the weather's nice for the most part and pick and choose my days. So yeah, it's definitely being a path that sort of fell into my lap. I went to the University of New Brunswick and it was about a year and a half in the undergraduate program there. And then the opportunity presented itself to do a master's. And I could complete the master's quicker than I could the undergraduate program. Plus, I got paid as part of a co-op program, so it was a no-brainer. So I jumped into this master's program, which really focused on what my career has become, which is very technology-based, computer-based.
So I'm curious, how did you even get introduced into forestry? You said you were naive and you kind of like science. So I'll explain why I'm asking that question. I have a chemistry degree, and when I was a senior, I got to take a hydrogeology class, and I thought, oh, this is something geologists do. This is really cool. I could totally get into this if I weren't a senior, right? Like, I found it really interesting and cool, and it wasn't something I'd known about until then. So I'm just curious, how did you get introduced into it?
Well, I guess I grew up for the most part in Newfoundland and Canada, very much in a remote community, and spent all my summers and spare time knocking around in the woods and playing around on lakes and, snaring rabbits and doing those sorts of things. And I just enjoyed nature. And once I got into university, when you're in high school, where I was in high school, it didn't really prepare you or give you a real good exposure to all the options that are out there. And so it was only once I was well into my undergraduate science degree that I really started sort of researching things, and forestry sort of came up on my radar, and it just seemed to check a lot of the boxes. I like the idea of managing natural resources. I like the idea of being out in the woods. And it just happened that apparently I have some aptitude with computers, and that opportunity to do this master's program just kind of fell in my lap. And so it was really serendipity to some degree, I feel. But I think it's worked out well. I've had a pretty good career so far and seen a lot of changes over the course of that career, but it's always been an interesting pathway.
So did you come to the States after your master's degree?
No, I was part of a co-op program at the University of New Brunswick, which was funded by industry. And before I even graduated, I was employed by a company in northern New Brunswick on the Miramichi, where there was a large pulp and paper company. We managed, at the end of my tenure there, we were managing about 1.2 million acres, mostly crown land. But there was a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of data management and computer management associated with that. The challenge that I faced and the reason for my first move was to actually South Carolina. And I went to a consulting company in South Carolina. And the reason for that was because in my career, I describe myself as a jack of all trades and a master of none. I had to do many different roles and responsibilities, but I never felt I was, an expert at any one. And the opportunity came up to go to South Carolina to work with a forestry consulting company. And my only role there was to be a forest modeler. And that was something that I really enjoyed. And it gave me some time to really focus on that expertise and to hopefully become better at it. So I spent a very short tenure in South Carolina. Then I got transferred to New Brunswick to open up an office for this company in New Brunswick. That kind of fell apart. And as a result, most of the consultants that I worked with formed our own consulting company. And in order for that to happen, I needed to be back in the US if I wanted to be a partner. So I didn't want to uphaul my family and take them back down to South Carolina. I said, well, I can hop across the border. Maybe Bangor would be a good location. And just by chance, this is where I landed. And I think we made the right decision. Yeah, so that's how we ended up in Maine.
That's great. So it sounds like the job in South Carolina allowed you to focus on the stuff that you enjoyed most from your master's work.
Yeah, even that was a little bit different from what I had done in my master's work. It was part of it, but the modeling side of forestry really intrigues me because you're building this model construct of a biological system, and you're trying to manipulate that in order to make decisions, to drive strategic management decisions, to help manage things like wildlife, biodiversity, to come up with sustainable levels of harvest and different types of harvesting regimes. So it was just a really intriguing side of it. And in my work in New Brunswick, when you make these models, about 98% of the work is getting the data ready to go into these models. And that's not fun work from my perspective. So it's that last 2% where you're doing the Woodstock, this forest modeling, that I really enjoyed. And by going to South Carolina at the time, I was handed data sets and basically I had just had to build the model. And so it just really allowed me to focus on that and to really focus on the art of sort of building, constructing those models and getting out of them what you need to make decisions.
Okay, so that seems to me a good lead in to what I heard you talk about and what I think you're doing at Seven Islands now, which is, like you said, large scale forest modeling and management. I've had quite a few forestry folks that I've spoken with for a podcast. I don't know that anyone has talked in the same way that I heard you speak about from the perspective of managing the forest, not just for the wood and the timber, but for the wildlife and the ecology and the whole large system and all the gazillion pieces of data that go into that and best guesses. So it's a lot. It reminds me of, almost what you think about with statistics in sports. You can hit a point where you're like, do we have too many? And I don't mean you have that, but you're like, it really is so many variables. So if you don't mind, I would love if you would give us an overview of the technology that you use to make this happen and the perspective of it's not just foresters out in the field. You guys have some really cool things going on, but then also how you try to decide the best way to do the modeling.
Yeah, there was a watershed moment for me, and this is when I was in New Brunswick. And at the time, we were using what we call a simulation model, where you put in the parameters. And in forestry, when we're dealing with these models, we tend to deal in 5-year chunks that we call a period. So in a simulation model, you have to tell the model you wanted to do this in the first period, and then you wanted to do it this in the second period. And so it's still a modeling approach, but you have to build up the solution. And at the time that I was in New Brunswick and we had to submit management plans to the government in managing of Crown lands, they put upon us some biodiversity criteria that we had to satisfy. And it was becoming ever apparent that simulation modeling was not the way to do this. The simulation model that we were using at the time probably took, typically I would fire it up before I left work and it would still be running when I came back the next morning. Like, it was a lengthy process. And the prospect of trying to satisfy this biodiversity constraint in the simulation model was just impossible. And that's when I got introduced to linear programming or optimization modeling. And we had a consultant come in, he sat down, he took the model that I had in place, built all the constructs to go into this linear programming model, and solved this biodiversity constraint in about 40 minutes. And I was just like, wow, okay. And ever since we've done that, I have never looked back. I have always adopted this modeling solution everywhere that I've been, including my role at Seven Islands now. So the difference being is that with the simulation model, where you look at that period 1, you make your decisions, move on to period 2, make those decisions. Now you could sort of set broader goals, and the optimization model would look at all of those periods at once, and it would juggle things all back and forth. So typically in these environments, we are modeling for 80 to 100 years. So we're looking 16 to 20 of these modeling periods. So with the linear programming, it was always sort of looking forward and looking back to see how it could juggle all of those metrics in each period to come up with a solution. And so that took a lot of, I guess, the manual guessing out of it that I would have had to done with a simulation model. So that was really the watershed moment for me, and I've never looked back. Now, to say that, a lot of work goes into these models, and it all starts with the data, and that data comes from the woods. So in my current position, we have thousands upon thousands of inventory plots out there in the woods where people have gone out and physically collected tree measurements on all of these different plots. So my first job in formulating one of these models is taking all of that data that we've collected over the years, and we do what we call, it's a growth and yield analysis. And there is a whole science in forestry called biometrics, which is forest measurement, but it's also understanding how trees grow and how they grow over time, not only individual trees, but how different conditions of trees grow and interact over time. So we take all that data, we do this growth and yield analysis, which allows us to create these projections from now into the future. So I've sort of alluded to before, these models are typically looking 80 or 100 years into the future. This growth and yield analysis produces what we call yield curves, which project different forest conditions 80 to 100 years into the future. So the power in that is that we can manipulate those, and we can do this growth and yield analysis and manipulate the data to kind of mimic some of the forest harvesting that we're doing in the woods, which helps us figure out what our sustainable harvest level is going to be. Because we have all this actual tree data, we can also make some other assumptions, such as we know, especially in Maine, for example, we know what kinds of habitat deer like. And so based on a forest composition, we can identify this habitat in these yield curves and build that into our modeling exercises as well. The other thing that we do in these models is it allows us to sort of take a huge land base, like the land base that we manage, and it's not one big chunk of land. There's going to be a portion of that land base which is tied up in deer yards, which are sort of state-mandated wildlife areas that we manage for. We also have some cooperative deer yards, which are voluntary, that we manage for. We also manage for riparian zones across ownership, because as you get closer to water, you want to manage those conditions a little bit differently. because we do want to protect water quality and make sure that we have no negative impacts on the forest that we're managing. And you can build in any other number of administrative boundaries within that. Some things that we do are pretty straightforward. We try to break our forest down into what we consider operable. We know that we can actually go and do stuff in this forest. There's always going to be a portion of our forest that is inoperable. Perhaps it's too steep a slope, too rocky, inaccessible, stuff that we're never going to get to. So all those sorts of factors we can tease out in these models that we build. When we talk about the tree species, and you can think about a huge land base that we manage, when we go and collect this data in the field, we're probably collecting upwards of 20 to 30 individual tree species. And all those tree species come at different sizes, different ages, and you have different, what we call forest stand structures, where you have differing heights of trees within a forest stand. And so on our ownership, we end up creating thousands of these yield curves. And these yield curves are what we put as input into this linear programming model. The second part of that, which I've kind of been talking about, is the geographical mapped areas. So we're also putting into this model that we know we have X acres of deer yards, we know we have X acres of riparian zones, there's X areas of special areas that we want to consider. We build those into these models as well. So there's a lot of data preparation that goes into building the inputs for this linear programming model. And it's a lot of work. We're just in a cycle of creating our next strategic plan, which is this 80-year planning exercise. And we've been basically doing our growth and yield analysis. It began last December. And so we've been doing that over the past year. And it's only within the last couple of months that we've been able to build our linear programming model. And we've got that functioning. And now we go through an exercise of doing some sensitivity analysis around those results. We present results to our managers, especially the foresters who work out there in the woods, the ones who are actually going to be implementing the harvesting and management on the ground. We look to them for a lot of feedback on the model results to see, do they make sense? Are they realistic? Is it something that we're going to be able to achieve? And so we go through that exercise of sort of validating this model. And one of the biggest challenges I've had my entire career is really when most people think about foresters, you're thinking about the foresters who are in the woods every day. They're counting the trees, they're dealing with the harvesting machines. And the stuff that I do is what I call very high level stuff. You've got those foresters who I often describe as they're the boots on the ground. I'm doing this sort of 100,000 feet in the air, look down on this entire ownership, trying to formulate this model. And it's always been a challenge to create some common language between those operational foresters, the boots on the ground guys, and the stuff that I do at a strategic level. I've spent a lot of time over the years trying to figure out how to do that, how to involve those boots on the ground people onto every aspect of this modeling exercise. So, they have a say in all of these cruise plots or this data that we collect on the ground and how that's structured. And they also help us figure out how we model the different types of harvesting that we want to do in our models. So that harvesting kind of mimics what they're doing out on the ground. And then it's just presenting results and making sure that it seems realistic to them, that it's achievable. So that's really been the big challenge of building these models, is just doing that data preparation, which I said is about 98% of the work. Then you build the model and you get out these results. Now, there's one extra step, which I haven't mentioned. And when I think about these linear programming models, I consider them pseudo-spatial. And what I mean by that is, yes, the model knows that there's 60,000 acres of deer yard out there, but it doesn't know specifically where it is. The model knows that there may be 12,000 acres of this type of softwood forest out there, but it doesn't know exactly where it is. And so the linear programming formulation is an optimization technique. So it ends up giving you an optimal solution based on what your primary goal is. So if I say I want to maximize our harvest volume, but I want to make that sustainable over the 80 years, you can do that. The model goes away and it formulates and comes up with an optimal solution. Once I have that optimal solution, the next step is to shove that output into this other simulation model, which basically takes that output and is now going to apply it to our maps. And so it is going to start to schedule where we're harvesting across our land base. And that software allows us to do things like set a minimum size for harvest block or a maximum size for harvest block. It also allows us to pay particular attention because the state regulations are very particular about clear cutting. And when you clear cut, you have to ensure there's a green up delay. So if you do a clear cut, there's a certain amount of time that has to transpire before you can do a clear cut adjacent to it. And so this model sort of takes care of that. It allows for that green up delay between clear cuts. So if you are doing a lot of clear cutting, then it kind of manages that and places them out on the landscape to satisfy those state regulations. And so that's kind of the last piece of the puzzle. Again, we can do some sensitivity analysis around that in terms of this, what I would call a blocked schedule. And we are just in the process of producing some of those products now, which we will present back to our managers who will sort of say, yes, that makes sense, or hey, can you fine tune this or tweak that? So it's very much an interactive exercise. And so a linear programming model is basically composed of two main things. You have a primary objective function. So we'll say we want to maximize harvest volume. That's our primary objective. But you can also set many, many constraints on a model. One important metric that we look at, which we're really buying into now, is a metric called relative density. And relative density is a metric which is forest health, longevity, and resilience. And so we can sort of set constraints in this model to ensure that the relative density is always in what we call a sweet spot, where we know it's going to be in the most healthy, resilient condition, not only today, but into the future. So we're trying to model for what we call a desired future condition. We want to make sure that the forest is going to be there in 80 years, all the characteristics that we want, not just including merchantable volume for all the harvesting we do and the forest products that we produce, but also to ensure that that future forest condition is out there for wildlife and for biodiversity and all those sorts of things. So we even do some sort of separate modeling exercises that get built into this other model, for example, to manage for the deer. There are a very specific set of conditions which define what deer habitat is, and we can build those into the models, and we can apply those rules to our deer yard land base. So we can say, we want to maximize deer yard habitat now and to 80 years in the future, and the model will go away, and it will try and produce as many acres of deer yard habitat as it can over that 80 years. And once you get that solution, I can sort of hard code that into the model solution as well. So there's a lot of things sort of interacting and at play, but that's kind of the modeling workflow in a nutshell, I guess.
So you said you do a strategic plan that looks out for 80 years and that you're in the midst of your current iteration. How often do you update that strategic plan?
Yeah, and this is the beauty of what I do, is we do this every 5 years. So every 5 years, it's like we're hitting the reset button. We get to sit down, revisit all of our assumptions about the forest and make changes as we see fit. If there's anything that's interesting about forestry is it's always changing. There's always something new that we have to consider, or maybe a new type of harvesting that we're doing that we haven't done before that we want to model. So every 5 years we go through this exercise. And so it's, to me, I see it as a road for continual improvement. Every 5 years we're learning from what we did in our previous 5 years, and we're making improvements for the next plan that we're preparing. we made some pretty significant changes for this 5-year plan, just in the way that we categorize and define our forest in these models. And I think that's going to lead to better results. And I think I'm seeing that when I look at our model results, and even when I look at our blocked solutions, the spatial solutions, I'm really liking what I'm seeing. So it's an interesting exercise because it is every 5 years, it's a chance to revisit and improve upon the work you've done before.
Do you ever find, let's say you're doing this one and you get it done and you do the modeling and it says, okay, this is how you should manage for the next 80 years for the optimum stuff. And do you ever find that what is recommended is really far afield of what you've been doing for the previous 5 years? Or is it more iterative, more like you said, it's continuous improvement, so there's not a big leap from one pocket of plans to the next?
Yeah, that speaks, I think, to the company I work for, is that, Seven Islands has been in the state of Maine since the 1840s. They've been managing this land base for a long time, and they know how they want to manage it. So yeah, every 5 years, in terms of a management style, it's not changing drastically, but we are making small changes, small tweaks. One of the biggest things that I've really been focusing on in my last 10 years here is the inventory system that we have in place. So when you think about all this data that we're collecting in the woods, when we collect that, we pay a lot of attention to the statistics behind that. When I think about a portion of our forest, we may actually have upwards of, say, 150 different forest conditions that we manage for. So when I say a different forest condition or strata, what I mean by this is you may have a sugar maple stand, a yellow birch sugar maple stand. That is a strata. It's a forest type. Just like red spruce balsam fir type is a forest type. And we have a whole continuum of those softwood conditions to hardwood, which have been stratified out. And we have about 150 plus that we probably stratify on our ownership. And so we have to collect data in each one of those strata. When we do that, we then look at the statistics for every single strata, and we try to make decisions about which are the ones which are most important, which ones are we comfortable accepting a larger margin of error in, which ones do we want to have a much tighter margin of error. There's a lot of statistical analysis going on in the background as well, to make sure that our inventory system is giving us the best estimates of our forest inventory that we can possibly get. So part of that comes from the data that we collect. It's also how we divide that forest up into this strata. And then the third component of that is, I'm getting back to the biometricians now, where we talk about the growth and yield models. And so over the last 10 years, I've been implementing a relatively new growth and yield model, which is specific to the New England states. I think that it really represents our forest well, which is why I've sort of implemented that at Seven Islands. So it's taking all that cruise data, all those different strata, and shoving it through this growth and yield model to create these projections. So that's how that works.
How much are you having to take into account the impact of climate change and the warming climate on how you address both your inventory and the projections? So I know when we spoke, and actually Aaron Whiteskyle told me Bangor is the point where the southern and the northern forests cross. That is fascinating. But is that just another variable that you're taking into account with all of these projections?
We do kind of capture that. And the way that I capture that is when I came to Seven Islands, I implemented what we call a rolling inventory system. So in a perfect world, we will hold on to data for 10 years. So in a perfect world, we should be sampling 10% of our needs every year. So if you think about that, as you're sampling every year, and as things like the climate is causing changes to happen and stuff, the trees are going to respond differently. They're going to grow a little bit differently. We're going to kind of capture that in our analysis that we do, this growth and yield exercise. So in some respects, it is captured. And as we see things like There's going to be some migration of tree species into the region, and some tree species migrate out as the climate changes. All that data collection that we do is going to capture that stuff. So it's kind of inherently built into our inventory system to some degree. One thing you haven't mentioned is spruce budworm. So spruce budworm is really starting to take off in the state of Maine. And this growth in the old model that we have, I'm able to model and do some growth projections of the impacts of the spruce budworm on the forest that we have. And so we have done sort of that analysis a couple of years ago now to look at what the impacts will be based on a new spruce budworm epidemic. So there are some things that we can use all these tools for to help us in some of these much broader, higher level issues as well.
Is there one technology or one technique that you have been surprised by, that you have found really useful, that you didn't expect when you first got into this field?
I don't think I'm so much surprised. It's just the speed at which technology is progressing. When I started out in New Brunswick, I won't tell you what year that was, but it was a long time ago. I can remember going in front of my mill manager, the pulp mill manager at the time, to justify spending $4,000 on a hard drive, which was maybe lucky if it was 20 gigabytes at the time. And since then, it's just pennies on the dollar for hard drive space. So the technology has really grown in leaps and bounds. Forestry, interestingly enough, has always been cutting edge. Forestry is one of the few industries who really adopted sort of forest modeling. They were one of the first industries to really adopt geographical information systems, where you have all these spatial maps sitting in a digital world, and it allows you to do all the manipulation and the data gathering and map making, all those sorts of activities. So it's always been a very exciting field in that respect. The things that are really starting to take off now, there's a couple of them. Remote sensing, which is where we're using imagery, which we can get either from airplanes, but we can get from satellites as well, and using that information to help us inventory our forests, which has the promise of helping us be much more efficient at our jobs and maybe a little bit better. One of the challenges there is just the cost of these technologies. They are quite cost prohibitive. So you've got the remote sensing. A lot of people have probably heard about LiDAR data, which is, again, another digital type of data which we can fly over our forest and we get a digital impression of what the forest is. And that is really revolutionizing the way that we look at the forests and the sorts of metrics that we use to describe forests. So both those technologies really starting to take off. And when I started this strategic planning exercise, I have started this exercise knowing that this exercise was the last time that we're using traditional photography. In the past, big forest companies always send planes up and they take a bunch of photography, and then people sit down and they look at all those photos and they start to delineate all these different forest conditions. It's a very labor-intensive process. And all that is getting replaced by this LiDAR and or remote sensing technology. So I suspect the next time we do a management plan, the primary data set that we're going to be using is probably going to be LiDAR or remote sensing or a combination of both. The other big thing that is really starting to take off is just how we use data. We're dealing with very large data sets, especially when you get into these LiDAR data sets and the remote sensing data sets. So you need the ability to process this data, and you need the ability to be able to present this data in meaningful ways to people who make decisions about managing the forest. And that is really taking off. So now we're also seeing a lot more integration of computer systems. So the GIS, the Geographical Information System, is now talking to our accounting system, which is now talking to our inventory system. So now you've got what used to be their own sort of standalone systems are now talking to each other. And that is just opening up a whole new world of analytical possibilities, of analysis, report making, We talk about having a lot of companies now have these dashboards, which are real time to reflect changing conditions or giving you metrics on your operations in the woods. So that is really very much a growing field. And it's very specialized. I'm very lucky to have a couple of younger guys on staff who have some pretty unique skill sets in terms of software that they understand or programming, scripting languages that they use that help us do all the things that I've just been talking about. So they're the big things that I see changing.
Yeah, I could see where being able to have the data used synergistically could make it so you have a better understanding overall of what's going on, almost, I'm not going to say minute by minute, but certainly month to month, and then start building that up.
Yeah, so we can start to link all this data with financial models that our upper management is using. It's linked into the modeling exercises that I do. It's providing all sorts of reports that people are using in their everyday decision making. It's also creating data that, those boots on the ground foresters are actually using in the woods to help them make decisions as well. So it really is an exciting time in the industry, and just how the technology is just exponentially changing at a very quick rate, and all of the advantages that that's going to bring to us in the future.
Well, Ian, I could force you to talk about this for hours more, but I'm going to end your endurance here. This has been really, really fascinating, and I appreciate hearing a deeper dive into the ways that forestry still relies heavily on what I think most of us imagine in our head a forester is, but there's also so much more to it. And I think you've done a great job describing it. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the work you're doing. I've said it more than once during these conversations I have with people that, Maine is the most forested state in the country. And that makes for really interesting ways to think about the land and what we use the forest for. And as you pointed out, it's not just for the timber. So thank you.
Well, I hope I have been able to explain myself sufficiently and not confuse you even more, because it is very complicated. But, we do try and do our best every day in managing our forest. And we're always looking at new ways and new tools to do it better.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by following us on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is executive produced and hosted by me, Kate Dickerson, and edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. And the Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.